England stood on the edge of oblivion. The Viking hordes had crushed kingdom after kingdom, leaving only one last stronghold, Wessex. If Wessex fell, there would be no England. But in the darkest hour, one man refused to surrender. A king who rose from exile, defied the invaders, and laid the foundation for a united England. This is the story of Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great was more than just a warrior king. He was a visionary leader who not only defended his kingdom against the Vikings, but also rebuilt and reformed it. Born in 849 AD, he became the King of Wessex, at a time when England was on the brink of collapse. Through military brilliance, strategic diplomacy, and groundbreaking reforms, he not only secured Wessex, but also laid the foundation for a unified England. His leadership in battle, commitment to education, and legal reforms earned him the rare title of the Great, the only English king to be honored this way. Without Alfred, the very idea of England might never have existed. In the 9th century, England was not a single, united nation. Instead, it was divided into 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, each with its own rulers, armies, and ambitions. Northumbria, in the north, was once a powerful kingdom, but had become weakened by internal struggles and Viking invasions. Mercia, located in the heart of England, was a dominant force for centuries, but had lost its strength and independence by Alfred's time. East Anglia, situated in the east, fell quickly to the Vikings, its rulers unable to withstand the Great Heathen Army. Wessex, in the south, remained the last stronghold of Anglo-Saxon resistance. While the other kingdoms fell, Wessex, under Alfred's leadership, stood firm against the Viking tide, ultimately shaping the future of England. These kingdoms were more than just territories. They were the battlegrounds for survival, power, and the fight for England's destiny. By the mid-800s and 70s, 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had collapsed. Only Wessex remained, standing alone against the Viking tide. If Wessex fell, Anglo-Saxon rule in England would be wiped out forever. The fate of the land now rested in the hands of one man, Alfred of Wessex. The Viking invasions further exacerbated the fragmentation. Beginning in the late 8th century, Norsemen from Scandinavia launched brutal raids on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and many of the once powerful kingdoms fell to Viking rule. By the time Alfred ascended the throne of Wessex, only his kingdom remained largely independent, with the Vikings controlling much of the rest of England. This fractured political landscape set the stage for Alfred's efforts to unite the kingdom and resist the Viking threat. This fragmentation of power made it difficult for any one kingdom to offer a unified defense against the Vikings. Each kingdom was preoccupied with its own survival and internal struggles, and there was no cohesive political force to challenge the growing power of the Viking invaders. Alfred's rise would mark the beginning of efforts to heal this fractured land and create a united English kingdom. The Viking invasions that began in the late 8th century had a devastating impact on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, leading to the fall of several of them. The Vikings, seafaring raiders from Scandinavia, were highly skilled in both naval warfare and pillaging, making them formidable opponents for the largely agrarian and less militarized Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The first Viking raids, late 8th century. The first major Viking raid on England occurred in 793 AD, when the Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne. This attack sent shockwaves across Christian Europe, as it was an attack on a sacred religious site, marking the beginning of the Viking Age. These early raids were brutal but sporadic, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were initially unprepared for such an invasion. The fall of Northumbria, 9th century. By the early 9th century, the Vikings began to settle along the eastern coast of England. Northumbria, once a powerful and prosperous kingdom, was one of the first to feel the full force of these raids. In 866, the Great Heathen Army, a large Viking force led by the legendary Viking leaders Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, invaded Northumbria. The kingdom quickly fell to the invaders, who captured its capital, York. Northumbria became a Viking-controlled territory, and the once thriving kingdom was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The fall of East Anglia, 869 AD. East Anglia, another Anglo-Saxon kingdom in the east of England, was similarly devastated by Viking incursions. In 869, the Vikings launched a devastating campaign against East Anglia, and its king, Edmund, was killed during the invasion. His martyrdom would later make him a saint, but it also marked the fall of East Anglia to Viking control. The Vikings established a strong presence here, further consolidating their hold over eastern England. The fall of Mercia, 874 AD. Mercia, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, also suffered from the Viking invasions. In the 800s and 70s, the Vikings shifted their attention to Mercia, where they initially made raids, then gradually began to establish their control. In 874, the Viking warlord Ivar the Boneless defeated the Mercian king and took control of the kingdom. Although some Mercian leaders still resisted, the Vikings were able to carve out their own territories in the Midlands, and Mercia never regained its former strength. Wessex as the last stronghold. By the time Alfred the Great became King of Wessex in 871 AD, the Viking invasions had nearly succeeded in bringing all of England under Viking control. Wessex was the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom still holding out, and Alfred inherited a kingdom under siege. The Vikings had established their dominance in the north, east, and Midlands, and many of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were either destroyed or severely weakened. Wessex, under Alfred's leadership, became the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance, with the Vikings threatening to conquer the entire island. The fall of these kingdoms left England divided, with the Vikings establishing their own rule over much of the land. This created a fractured and unstable political landscape, where survival depended on the ability to resist the growing Viking influence. Alfred's reign would prove to be the turning point in this struggle, as he would lead Wessex in the defense against the Vikings and lay the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. His successes in battle, alongside his military and cultural reforms, would ultimately restore Anglo-Saxon power and establish a legacy of unity and resilience that would shape England's future. The devastation caused by Viking raids was profound, and their impact on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms cannot be overstated. These raids were not just violent attacks, but a series of psychological, cultural, and economic blows that left lasting scars on the affected regions. Here's how the Viking invasions wreaked havoc across England. The Viking raiders were notorious for their brutality, and their attacks left entire towns, villages, and monasteries in ruins. The Vikings were adept at raiding swiftly, often catching their targets off guard. They would strike during the night or early morning, pillaging settlements, burning buildings, and stealing precious resources. One of the most shocking aspects of the Viking raids was their targeting of religious sites, particularly monasteries. Monasteries were not only religious centers, but also hubs of wealth and learning. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 AD was one of the earliest and most infamous. The Vikings looted sacred relics, killed monks, and burned the monastery to the ground. This attack sent shockwaves through the Christian world, as it was a sacred space, something unimaginable at the time. Towns and villages were frequently ransacked. For example, in 875, the Vikings attacked and destroyed Winchester, the capital of Wessex, and other important towns in Mercia and Northumbria. The Vikings would often leave a path of destruction, burning crops, killing livestock, and decimating the infrastructure. These attacks were not random. They aimed to weaken the kingdoms economically and demoralize the local population. The raids caused massive loss of life, with whole communities being slaughtered or enslaved. Many Anglo-Saxon kings and their warriors fought valiantly to defend their lands, but the Vikings often outnumbered or outmaneuvered them. Battles like the Battle of Edington, 878 AD, marked turning points, but before that, the Vikings left death in their wake. The Vikings would often kill anyone who resisted their raids, including civilians, clergy, and soldiers. In some cases, they would take captives to sell into slavery or demand ransom. For example, after their capture of York in 866 AD, the Vikings slaughtered many of the inhabitants and took the rest as slaves. The trauma from these acts of violence deeply affected the Anglo-Saxon population and disrupted their way of life. Beyond physical death, the raids instilled fear and terror across the kingdoms. People lived in constant anxiety, knowing that their villages could be razed at any moment. The unpredictability of Viking raids kept many in a state of insecurity, and the psychological trauma lingered long after the physical damage was repaired. The raids devastated the economies of the affected kingdoms. The Vikings targeted wealthy monasteries, cities, and towns because of their material wealth, including gold, silver, and valuable commodities. But the economic impact went far beyond the looting of treasure. The Anglo-Saxon economy relied heavily on trade, and the Viking raids disrupted these economic networks. As towns were destroyed and roads became dangerous, trade routes were severely impacted. This led to a decline in the availability of goods and services, further weakening the kingdoms. Agriculture, which was the backbone of the Anglo-Saxon economy, was also impacted. Viking raids often targeted farms and destroyed crops, which meant food shortages for the local population. The destruction of livestock and the burning of crops left the kingdom vulnerable to famine and made it difficult for communities to recover in the aftermath of each raid. The Viking raids also caused significant cultural and social disintegration. Many of the monasteries and towns destroyed by the Vikings were centers of Anglo-Saxon learning, culture, and Christianity. The loss of these institutions meant that much of the Anglo-Saxon heritage, including books, manuscripts, and religious artifacts, was lost or damaged. Monasteries were often the centers of education and learning in Anglo-Saxon England, preserving knowledge through manuscripts and books. When Vikings attacked these monasteries, much of that knowledge was lost, setting back cultural development. The sacking of Lindisfarne, for instance, not only caused the loss of lives, but also destroyed irreplaceable religious and historical texts. The constant threat of Viking raids and the destruction they brought led to a breakdown in social structures. Communities were displaced, and people were forced to abandon their homes. Many farmers and craftsmen were left without livelihoods, while families were torn apart either by death or capture. This created a society in constant turmoil, where survival became the primary focus. As the raids continued, the Vikings began to establish their own strongholds in the lands they had conquered. They not only looted but settled in the areas they invaded, establishing the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory in much of northern and eastern England. This shift in power further fragmented the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, making it difficult for them to resist the Viking threat as a united force. As the Vikings ravaged the land, tearing apart kingdoms and threatening to erase the Anglo-Saxon world, one kingdom remained, Wessex. Alfred the Great would rise from the ashes of destruction, becoming the last hope for England. But his journey was just the beginning. In Part 2, we'll dive into Alfred's rise to power, his legendary military victories, and how he laid the groundwork for a unified England. Then, in Part 3, we'll explore how his son Edward and grandson Athelstan would complete his mission, securing the future of England and its legacy as a unified nation. You won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned for Part 2.